Hello. Apologies for the aborted beginning to this live stream. This shirt seems more relevant than ever. So, I just have to tweet out the link. All right. Beginning on page 228, which will take us to 243. There's no real page break. I already looked ahead. We'll see how I feel when I get here, whether I want to read on or leave things a bit early. I'm trying to talk into the laptop. The objectivation of art, which is what society from its external perspective takes to be art's fetishism, is itself social in that it is the product of the division of labor. That is why the relation of art to society is not to be sought primarily in the sphere of reception. This relation is anterior to reception in production. Interest in the social decipherment of art must orient itself to production rather than being content with the study and classification of effects that for social reasons often totally diverge from the artworks and their objective social content. Since time immemorial, human reactions to artworks have been mediated to their utmost and do not refer immediately to the object. Indeed, they are now mediated by society as a whole. The study of social effect neither comes close to understanding what is social in art, nor is it in any position to dictate norms for art, as it is inclined to do by a positivist spirit. The heteronomy which reception theory's normative interpretation of phenomena foists on art is an ideological fetter that exceeds everything ideological that may be inherent in art's fetishization. Art and society converge in the artwork's content, not in anything external to it. This applies also to the history of art. Collectivization of the individual takes place at the cost of the social force of production. In the history of art, real history returns by virtue of the life of the productive force that originates in real history and is then separated from it. This is the basis of art's recollection of transience. Art preserves it and makes it present by transforming it. This is the social explanation of its temporal nucleus. Abstaining from praxis, art becomes the schema of social praxis. Every authentic artwork is internally revolutionary. However, whereas society reaches into art and disappears there by means of the identity of forces and relations, even the most advanced art has, conversely, the tendency towards social integration. Yet, contrary to the cliché that touts the virtues of progress, this integration does not bring the blessings of justice in the form of retrospective confirmation. More often, reception wears away what constitutes the work's determinate negation of society. Works are usually critical in the era in which they appear. Later, they are neutralized, not least because of changed social relations. Neutralization is the social price of aesthetic autonomy. However, once artworks are entombed in the pantheon of cultural commodities, they themselves, their truth content, are also damaged. In the administered world, neutralization is universal. Surrealism began as a protest against the fetishization of art as an isolated realm. Yet as art, which after all surrealism also was, it was forced beyond the pure form of protest. Painters for whom the quality of peinture was not an issue, as it was for André Masson, struck a balance between scandal and social reception. Ultimately, Salvador Dali became an exalted society painter, the Laszlo Van Dogen of a generation that liked to think of itself as being sophisticated on the basis of a vague sense of a crisis that had in any case been stabilized for decades. Thus, the false afterlife of surrealism was established. Modern tendencies, in which erupting, shock-laden contents demolish the law of form, are predestined to make peace with the world, which gives a cozy reception to unsublimated material as soon as the thorn is removed. In the age of total neutralization, false reconciliation has of course also paved the way in the sphere of radically abstract art. Non-representational art is suitable for decorating the walls of the newly prosperous. It is uncertain whether that also diminishes the imminent quality of artworks. The excitement with which reactionaries emphasize this danger speaks against its reality. It would be truly idealistic to locate the relation of art and society exclusively as mediated in problems of social structure. Art's double character, its autonomy and fait social, is expressed ever and again in the palpable dependencies and conflicts between the two spheres. Frequently, there are direct socioeconomic interventions in artistic production, a contemporary instance of which is the long-term contracts between painters and art merchants who favor what is called work with a personal touch, or more bluntly, a gimmick. That German expressionism vanished so quickly may have its artistic reasons in the conflict between the idea of an artwork, which remained its goal, and the specific idea of the absolute screen. Expressionist works could not totally succeed without betraying themselves. Also important was that the genre became politically obsolete as its revolutionary impetus went unrealized and the Soviet Union began to prosecute radical art. Nor should it be concealed that the authors of that movement, which went unreceived until 40 or 50 years later, had to make a living and were compelled, as Americans say, to go commercial. This could be demonstrated in the case of most German expressionist writers who survived World War I. What is sociologically to be learned from the fate of the expressionists is the primacy of the bourgeois profession over the need for expression that inspired the expressionists in however naive and diluted a fashion. In bourgeois society, artists, like all who are intellectually productive, are compelled to keep at it once they have taken on the trade name of artist. Superannuated expressionists not unwillingly chose marketably promising themes. The lack of any imminent necessity for production, coupled with the concurrent economic compulsion to continue, is apparent in the product as its objective insignificance. Among the mediations of art and society, the thematic, the open or covert treatment of social matters, is the most superficial and deceptive. The claim that the sculpture of a coal miner a priori says more socially than a sculpture without proletarian hero is by now echoed only where art is used for the purpose of forming opinion, in the wooden language of the people's democracies of the Eastern Bloc, and is subordinated to empirical aims, mostly as a means for improving production. Emile Meunier's idealized coal miner and his realism dovetail with a bourgeois ideology that dealt with the then still visible proletariat by certifying that it too was beautiful humanity and noble nature. Even unvarnished naturalism is often of a part with a deformed bourgeois character structure, a suppressed, in psychoanalytic terms, anal pleasure. It feeds on the suffering and decay it scourges. Like Blut and Boden authors, Zola glorified fertility and employed anti-Semitic cliches. On the thematic level, in the language of indictment, no boundary can be drawn between aggressiveness and conformism. An agitprop chorus of the unemployed with the performance directive that it can be performed in an ugly fashion may have functioned around 1930 as a certificate of correct political opinion, though it hardly ever testified to progressive consciousness. But it was always uncertain if the artistic stance of growling and raw technique really denounced such things or identified with them. Real denunciation is probably only a capacity of form, which is overlooked by a social aesthetic that believes in themes. What is socially decisive in artworks is the content that becomes eloquent through the work's formal structures. Kafka, in whose work monopoly capitalism appears only distantly, codifies in the dregs of the administered world what becomes of people under the total social spell more faithfully and powerfully than do any novels about corrupt industrial trusts. The thesis that form is the locus of social content can be concretely shown in Kafka's language. Its objectivity, its Kleistian quality has often been remarked upon, and readers who measure up to Kafka have recognized the contradiction between that objectivity and events that become remote through the imaginary character of so sober a presentation. However, this contrast becomes productive not only because the quasi-realistic description brings the impossible menacingly close. At the same time, this critique of the realistic lineaments of Kafka's form, a critique that to socially committed ears seems all too artistic, has its social aspect. Kafka is made acceptable by many of these realistic lineaments as an ideal of order, possibly of a simple life and modest activity in one's assigned station, an ideal that is itself a mask of social repression. The linguistic habitus of the world is as it is the medium through which the social spell becomes aesthetic appearance. Kafka wisely guards against naming it, as if otherwise the spell would be broken, whose insurmountable omnipresence defines the arena of Kafka's work and which, as its a priori, cannot become thematic. His language is the instrument of that configuration of positivism and myth that has only now become obvious socially. Reified consciousness, which presupposes and confirms the inevitability and immutableness of what exists, is, as the heritage of the ancient spell, the new form of the myth of the ever-same. Kafka's epic style is, in its archaism, mimesis of reification. Whereas his work must renounce any claim to transcending myth, it makes the social web of delusion knowable in myth through the how, through language. In his writing, absurdity is as self-evident as it has actually become in society. Those products are socially mute that do their duty by regurgitating tel quel whatever social material they treat and count this metabolic exchange with second nature as the glory of art, as social reflection. The artistic subject is inherently social, not private. In no case does it become social through forced collectivization or the choice of subject matter. In the age of repressive collectivization, art has the power to resist the compact majority, a resistance that has become a criterion of the work and its social truth, in the lonely and exposed producer of art, while at the same time this does not exclude collective forms of production such as the composer's workshop that Schoenberg envisioned. By constantly admitting into the production of his work an element of negativity toward his own immediacy, the artist unconsciously obeys a social universal. In every successfully realized correction, watching over the artist's shoulder is a collective subject that has yet to be realized. The categories of artistic objectivity are unitary with social emancipation when the object, on the basis of its own impulse, liberates itself from social convention and controls. Yet artworks cannot be satisfied with vague and abstract universalities such as that of classicism. Rather, they are predicated on physiogness, and thus on the concrete historical situation. Their social truth depends on their opening themselves to this content. The content becomes their subject, to which they mold themselves, to the same extent that their law of form does not obscure the fissures, but rather, in demanding that it be shaped, makes it its own concern. However profound and still largely obscure the part of science has been in the development of artistic forces of production, and however deeply, precisely through methods learned from science, society reaches into art, just so little is artistic production scientific, even when it is a work of integral constructivism. In art, all scientific discoveries lose their literal character. This is evident in the modification of optical perspectival laws in painting and in the natural overtone relations in music. When art, intimidated by technique, tries to conserve its miniature terrain by proclaiming its transformation into science, it misconceives the status of the sciences in empirical reality. On the other hand, the aesthetic principle is not to be played out as sacrosanct, as would suit irrationalism, in opposition to the sciences. Art is not an arbitrary cultural complement to science, but rather stands in critical tension to it. When, for instance, the cultural and the human sciences are rightly accused of a lack of spirit, this is almost always at the same time a lack of aesthetic discernment. It is not without reason that the certified sciences demand furiously to be left in peace whenever art, whatever they attribute to it, intervenes in their sphere. That someone can write is cause for suspicion on a scientific grounds. Crudeness of thinking is the incapacity to differentiate within a topic. And differentiation is an aesthetic category as much as one of understanding. Science and art are not to be fused, but the categories that are valid in each are not absolutely different. Conformist consciousness prefers the opposite, partially because it is incapable of distinguishing the two, and partially because it refuses the insight that identical forces are active in non-identical spheres. The same holds true with regard to morality. Brutality toward things is potentially brutality toward people. The raw, the subjective nucleus of evil, is a priori negated by art, from which the ideal of being fully formed is indispensable. This, and not the pronouncement of moral theses or the striving after moral effects, is art's participation in the moral and makes it part of a more humanly worthy society. Social struggles and the relations of classes are imprinted in the structure of artworks. By contrast, the political positions deliberately adopted by artworks are epiphenomena and usually impinge on the elaboration of works and thus, ultimately, on their social truth content. Political opinions count for little. It is possible to argue over how much Attic tragedy, including those by Euripides, took part in the violent social conflicts of the epoch. However, the basic tendency of tragic form, in contrast to its mythical subjects, the dissolution of the spell of fate and the birth of subjectivity, bears witness as much to social emancipation from feudal family ties as, in the collision between mythical law and subjectivity, to the antagonism between fateful domination and a humanity awakening to maturity. That this antagonism, as well as the historico-philosophical tendency, became an a priori of form rather than being treated simply as thematic material, endowed tragedy with its social substantiality. Society appears in it all the more authentically the less it is the intended object. Real partisanship, which is the virtue of artworks no less than of men and women, resides in the depths where the social antinomies become the dialectic of forms. By leading them to language through the synthesis of the work, artists do their part socially. Even Lukács in his last years found himself compelled toward such considerations. Figuration, which articulates the wordless and mute contradictions, thereby has the lineaments of a praxis that is not simply flight from real praxis. Figuration fulfills the concept of art itself as a comportment, is a form of praxis and need not apologize that it does not act directly, which it could not do even if it wanted to. The political effects even of so-called committed art is highly uncertain. The social standpoint of artists may serve to interfere with conformist consciousness, but in the actual development of works they become insignificant. That he expressed abominable views when Voltaire died says nothing about the truth content of Mozart's works. At the actual time when artworks appear, there is certainly no abstracting from their intention. Whoever would attempt an assessment of Brecht exclusively on the basis of the artistic merits of his works would fail him no less than one who judges his meaning according to his theses. The immanence of society in the artwork is the essential social relation of art, not the immanence of art in society. Because the social content of art is not located externally to its principium individuationis, but rather inheres in individuation, which is itself a social reality, art's social character is concealed and can only be grasped by its interpretation. Yet even in artworks that are to their very core ideological, truth content can assert itself. Ideology, socially necessary semblance, is by the same necessity also the distorted image of the true. A threshold that divides the social consciousness of aesthetics from the Philistine is that the aesthetics reflects the social critique of the ideological in artworks, rather than mechanically reiterating it. Stifter provides a model of the truth content of an oeuvre that is undoubtedly ideological in its intentions. Not only the conservative restorative choice of thematic material and the fabula docet are ideological, but so is the objectivistic deportment of the form, which suggests a micrologically tender world, a meaningfully correct life that lends itself to narration. This is why Stifter became the idol of a retrospectively noble bourgeoisie. Yet the layers of his work that once provided him with his half-esoteric popularity have with time peeled away and vanished. This, however, is not the last word on Stifter, for the reconciling, conciliatory aspects, especially in his last works, are exaggerated. Here, objectivity hardens into a mask and the life evoked becomes a defensive ritual. Shimmering through the eccentricity of the average is the secret and denied suffering of the alienated subject in an unreconciled life. The light that falls over his mature prose is drained and bleak, as if it were allergic to the happiness of color. It is, as it were, reduced to a pencil sketch by the exclusion of everything unruly and disturbing to a social reality that was as incompatible with the mentality of the poet as with the epic a priori that he took from Goethe and clung to. What transpires, in opposition to the will of his prose, through the discrepancy between its form and the already capitalist society devolves upon its expression. Ideological exaggeration endows his work immediately with its non-ideological truth content, with its superiority over all consoling, assiduously pastoral literature, and it won for that authentic quality that Nietzsche admired. Stifter is the paradigm of how little poetic intention, even that meaning that is directly embodied or represented in an artwork, approximates its objective content. In his work, the content is truly the negation of the meaning, yet this content would not exist if the meaning were not intended by the work and then cancelled and transformed by the work's own complexion. Affirmation becomes the cipher of despair, and the purest negativity of content contains, as in Stifter, a grain of affirmation. The iridescence that emanates from artworks, which today taboo all affirmation, is the appearance of the affirmative ineffable, the emergence of the non-existing as if it did exist. Its claim to existence flickers out in aesthetic semblance, yet what does not exist by appearing is promised. The constellation of the existing and non-existing is the utopic figure of art. Although it is compelled toward absolute negativity, it is precisely by virtue of this negativity that it is not absolutely negative. By no means do artworks primarily develop this inwardly antinomial affirmative element as a result of their external attitude to what exists, that is, to society. Rather, it develops immanently in them and immerses them in twilight. No beauty today can evade the question whether it is actually beautiful and not instead surreptitiously acquired by static affirmation. The antipathy toward applied arts is, indirectly, the bad conscience of art as a whole, which makes itself felt at the sound of every musical chord and at the sight of every color. There is no need for social criticism of art to investigate this externally. It emerges from the inner aesthetic formations themselves. The heightened sensitivity of the aesthetic sensorium converges asymptotically with the socially motivated irritability toward art. In art, ideology and truth cannot be neatly distinguished from each other. Art cannot have one without the other, and this reciprocity in turn is an enticement toward the ideological misuse of art as much as it is an enticement towards summarily finishing it off. It is only a step from the utopia of the self-likeness of artworks to the stink of the heavenly roses that art scatters from here below, as do the women in Schiller's tirade. The more brazenly society is transformed into totality in which it assigns everything, including art, to its place, the more completely does art polarize into ideology and protest, and this polarization is hardly to art's advantage. Absolute protest constrains it and carries over to its own raison d'etre. Ideology thins out to an impoverished and authoritarian copy of reality. In the culture resurrected after the catastrophe, art, regardless of its content and substance, has even taken on an ideological aspect by its mere existence. In its disproportion to the horror that has transpired and threatens, it is condemned to cynicism. Even where it directly faces the horror, it diverts attention from it. Its objectivation implies insensitivity to reality. This degrades art to an accomplice of the barbarism to which it succumbs no less than when it renounces objectivation and directly plays along, even when this takes the form of polemical commitment. Every artwork today, the radical ones included, has its conservative aspects. Its existence helps to secure the spheres of spirit and culture, whose real powerlessness and complicity with the principle of disaster becomes plainly evident. But this conservative element, which, contrary to the trend towards social integration, is stronger in advanced works than in the more moderate ones, does not simply deserve oblivion. Only insofar as spirit, in its most advanced form, survives and perseveres, is any opposition to the total domination of the social totality possible. A humanity to which progressive spirit fails to bequeath what humanity is poised to liquidate would appear in a barbarism that a reasonable social order should prevent. Art, even as something tolerated in the administered world, embodies what does not allow itself to be managed and what total management suppresses. Greece's new tyrants knew why they banned Beckett's plays, in which there is not a single political word. Asociality becomes the social legitimation of art. For the sake of reconciliation, authentic works must blot out every trace of reconciliation in memory. All the same, the unity that even disassociative works do not escape is not without a trace of the old reconciliation. Artworks are, a priori, socially culpable, and each one that deserves its name seeks to expiate this guilt. Their possibility of surviving requires that their straining towards synthesis develop in the form of their irreconcilability. Without the synthesis, which confronts reality as the autonomous artwork, there would be nothing external to reality's spell. The principle of the isolation of spirit, which casts a spell around itself, is also the principle that breaks through the spell by making it determinate. That the nominalistic tendency of art toward the destruction of all pre-established categories of order has social implications is evident in the enemies of modern art, right up to Emil Steiger. Their sympathy for what they call a Leitbild, a guiding principle, is precisely their sympathy for social, particularly sexual, repression. The bond between a socially reactionary posture and hatred for the artistically modern, which the analysis of the obedient character makes apparent, is documented by new and old fascist propaganda, and it is also confirmed by empirical social research. The rage against the purported destruction of sacrosanct cultural goods, which for that reason alone can no longer be experienced as such, serves to mask the real destructive wishes of the indignant. For the ruling consciousness, any consciousness that would have the world other than it is always seems chaotic because it deviates from a petrified reality. Inevitably, those who rail loudest against the anarchy of modern art, which for the most part hardly exists, convince themselves of what they presume to be the nature of their enemy on the basis of crude errors at the simplest levels of information. Indeed, there is no responding to them, because what they have decided in advance to reject, they are not willing to experience in the first place. In this, the division of labor incontestably bears part of the blame. The non-specialist will no more understand the most recent developments in nuclear physics than the layperson will straightaway grasp extremely complex new music or painting. Whereas, however, the incomprehensibility of physics is accepted on the assumption that, in principle, its rationality can be followed and its theorems understood by anyone, modern art's incomprehensibility is branded as schizoid arbitrariness, even though the aesthetically incomprehensible gives way to experience no less than does the scientifically obscure. If art is capable of realizing its humane universality at all, then it is exclusively by means of the rigorous division of labor. Anything else is false consciousness. Works of quality, those that are fully formed in themselves, are objectively less chaotic than innumerable works that have orderly facades somehow slapped on while underneath their own structure crumbles. Few are disturbed by this. Deep down and contrary to its better judgments, the bourgeois character tends to cling to what is inferior. It is fundamental to ideology that it is never fully believed and that it advances from self-disdain to self-destruction. The semi-educated consciousness insists on the "I like that," laughing with cynical embarrassment at the fact that cultural trash is expressly made to dupe this consumer. As a leisure time occupation, art should be cozy and discretionary. People put up with the deception because they sense secretly that the principle of their own sane realism is the fraud of equal exchange. It is within this false and at the same time art-alien consciousness that the fictional element of art, its illusoriness, develops in bourgeois society. Mundus vult decipi is the categorical imperative of artistic consumption. This taints all supposedly naive artistic experience, and to this extent, it is not naive. The dominant consciousness is objectively led to this dank attitude because the administered must renounce the possibility of maturity, including aesthetic maturity, that is postulated by the order that they cling to as their own and at any price. The critical concept of society, which inheres in authentic artworks without needing to be added to them, is incompatible with what society must think of itself if it is to continue as it is. The ruling consciousness cannot free itself from its own ideology without endangering society's self-preservation. This confers social relevance on apparently derivative aesthetic controversies. That society appears in artworks with polemical truth as well as ideologically is conducive to historico-philosophical mystification. Speculation all too easily falls prey to the idea of a harmony between society and artworks that has been pre-established by the world spirit. But theory must not capitulate to that relationship. The process that transpires in artworks and is brought to a standstill in them is to be conceived as the same social process in which the artworks are embedded. According to Leibniz's formulation, they represent this process windowlessly. The elements of an artwork acquire their configuration as a whole in obedience to immanent laws that are related to those of the society external to it. Social forces of production, as well as relations of production, returns in artworks as mere forms divested of their facticity because artistic labor is social labor. Moreover, they are always the product of this labor. In artworks, the forces of production are not in themselves different from social productive forces except by their constitutive absenting from real society. Scarcely anything is done or produced in artworks that does not have its model, however latently, in social production. The binding force of artworks, beyond the jurisdiction of their immanence, originates in this affinity. If artworks are in fact absolute commodities in that they are a social product that has rejected every semblance of existing for society, a semblance to which commodities otherwise urgently cling, the determining relation of production, the commodity form, enters the artwork equally with the social force of production and the antagonism between the two. The absolute commodity would be free of the ideology inherent in the commodity form, which pretends to exist for another, whereas ironically it is something merely for itself. It exists for those who hold power. This reversal of ideology into truth is a reversal of aesthetic content, and not immediately a reversal of the attitude of art to society. Even the absolute commodity remains saleable and has become a natural monopoly. That artworks are offered for sale at the market, just as pots and statuettes once were, is not their misuse, but rather the simple consequence of their participation in the relations of production. Thoroughly non-ideological art is indeed probably completely impossible. Its mere antithesis to empirical reality does not suffice to make it so. Sartre rightly accented that the principle of l'art pour l'art, which has prevailed in France since Baudelaire, just as in Germany the aesthetic ideal of art prevailed as an institution of moral reform, was taken up by the bourgeoisie as a means for the neutralization of art with the same willingness with which in Germany art was appropriated as a costumed ally of social control and order. What is ideological in the principle of l'art pour l'art does not have its locus in the energetic antithesis of art to the empirical world, but rather in the abstractness and facile character of this antithesis. The idea of beauty advocated by l'art pour l'art, at least as it has developed since Baudelaire, was not to be classical formalism, yet it did indeed exclude all content as disruptive that did not, before undergoing the law of form and thus precisely anti-artistically, submit to a dogmatic canon of beauty. It is in this spirit that George in a letter excoriates Hofmannsthal for having allowed the painter in the death of Titian to die of the plague. L'art pour l'art's concept of beauty becomes at once strangely empty and imprisoned by thematic material, a sort of Jugendstil arrangement as revealed in Ibsen's formulaic descriptions of vine leaves entwined in locks of hair and of dying in beauty. Beauty, powerless to define itself and only able to gain its definition by way of its other, a sort of aerial root, becomes entangled in the fate of artificial ornamentation. The idea of beauty is limited because it sets itself up as directly antithetical to a society rejected as ugly rather than, as Baudelaire and Rimbaud did, extracting this antithesis from the content, from the imagery of Paris in Baudelaire's instance, and putting it to the test. Only in this fashion could sheer distance become the intervention of determinate negation. It is precisely the autarky of neo-romantic and symbolist beauty, its timidity vis-à-vis those social elements in which form exclusively becomes form, that accounts for its rapid transformation into something so easily consumable. This beauty deceives about the commodity world by setting it aside. This qualifies it as a commodity. Their latent commodity form has inner-artistically condemned the works of l'art pour l'art to kitsch, as which they are totally ridiculed. In Rimbaud, it would be possible to show that bitterly sarcastic opposition to society cohabits uncritically with a submissiveness comparable to Rilke's capture of her cabaret songs and the fragrance of an old chest, rapture. Ultimately, it was affirmation that triumphed, and the principle of l'art pour l'art was not to be saved. It is for this reason that socially the situation of art is today aporetic. If art cedes its autonomy, it delivers itself over to the machinations of the status quo. If art remains strictly for itself, it nonetheless submits its integration as one harmless domain among others. The social totality appears in this aporia, swallowing whole whatever occurs. That works renounce communication is a necessary yet by no means sufficient condition for the unideological essence. The essential criterion is the force of expression, through the tension of which artworks become eloquent with wordless gesture. In expression, they reveal themselves as the wounds of society. Expression is the social ferment of their autonomous form. The principal witness for this is Picasso's Guernica, that, strictly incompatible with prescribed realism, precisely by means of inhumane construction, achieves a level of expression that sharpens it to social protest beyond all contemplative misunderstanding. The socially critical zones of artworks are those where it hurts, where in their expression, historically determined, the untruth of the social situation comes to light. It is actually this against which the rage at art reacts. Artworks are able to appropriate their heterogeneous element, their entwinement with society, because they are themselves always at the same time something social. Nevertheless, art's autonomy, wrested painfully from society as well as socially derived in itself, has the potential of reversing interheteronomy. Everything new is weaker than the accumulated ever same, and it is ready to regress back into it. The we encapsulated in the objectivation of works is not radically other than the external we. However, frequently it is the residue of a real we that is past. That is why collective appeal is not simply the original sin of artworks. Rather, something in their law of form implies it. Situating a work involves exiting from the aesthetic sphere, the cheap sovereignty that assigns art its social position, after dismissing its immanence of form as a vain and naive self-delusion, tends to treat the work as if it were nothing but what its social function condemns it to. The good and bad marks Plato distributed to art according to whether or not it conformed to the military virtues of the community he confused with utopia, his totalitarian rancor against real or spitefully invented decadence, even his aversion to the lives of poets, which are after all nothing but art's semblance character, which Plato hoped to summon to the support of the status quo, all this taints the concept of art in the same moment in which it was first consciously reflected upon. The purging of the affects in Aristotle's Poetics no longer makes equally frank admission of its devotion to ruling interests, yet it supports them all the same in that his ideal of sublimation entrusts art with the task of providing aesthetic semblance as a substitute satisfaction for the bodily satisfaction of the targeted public's interests and needs. Catharsis is a purging action directed against the affects and an ally of repression. Aristotelian catharsis is part of a superannuated mythology of art and inadequate to the actual effects of art. In return, artworks have realized in themselves by spiritualization what the Greeks projected on their external effect. They are, in the process they carry out between the law of form and the material content, their own catharsis. Sublimation, even aesthetic sublimation, incontestably participates in civilizatory progress and even in inner artistic progress itself, but it also has its ideological side. Art is a surrogate satisfaction by virtue of the fact that it is spurious, robs sublimation of the dignity for which the whole of classicism made propaganda, a classicism that survives for more than 2,000 years under the protection of Aristotle's authority. The doctrine of catharsis imputes to art the principle that ultimately the culture industry appropriates and administers. The index of its untruth is the well-founded doubt whether the salutary Aristotelian effect ever occurred. Substitute satisfaction may well have spawned repressed instincts. Even the category of the new, which in the artwork represents what has yet to exist and that whereby the work transcends the given, bears the scar of the ever-same underneath the constantly new. Consciousness, fettered to this day, has not gained mastery over the new, not even in the image. Consciousness dreams of the new, but is not able to dream the new itself. If the emancipation of art was possible only through the appropriation of the commodity character, through which art gained the semblance of its being in itself, then in the course of that development the commodity character was dropped from the artworks. Jugendstil played no small role in this, with its ideology of the reintroduction of art into life, as well as with the sensations of Wilde, D'Annunzio, and Maeterlinck, who served as preludes to the culture industry. Progressive subjective differentiation, the heightening and expansion of the sphere of aesthetic stimuli, made these stimuli manipulable. They were able to be produced for the cultural marketplace. The attunement of art to the most fleeting individual reactions was bound up with the reification of these actions. Art's growing similarity to subjective physical existence distanced it, as far as the majority of artistic production was concerned, from its objectivity and at the same time commended it to the public. To this extent, the watchword l'art par l'art was the mask of its opposite. What is true in the uproar over decadence is that subjective differentiation has an aspect of ego weakness, an aspect shared with the mentality of the culture industry's customers and something the culture industry knew how to exploit. Kitsch is not, as those believers in erudite culture would like to imagine, the mere refuse of art, originating in disloyal accommodation to the enemy. Rather, it lurks in art, awaiting ever-recurring opportunities to spring forth. Although kitsch escapes, imp-like, from even a historical definition, one of its most tenacious characteristics is the prevarication of feelings, fictional feelings in which no one is actually participating, and thus the neutralization of these feelings. Kitsch parodies catharsis. Ambitious art, however, produces the same fiction of feelings. Indeed, this was essential to it. The documentation of actually existing feelings, the recapitulation of psychical raw material, is foreign to it. It is in vain to try to draw the boundaries abstractly between aesthetic fiction and kitsch's emotional plunder. It is a poison admixed to all art. Excising it is today one of art's despairing efforts. The vulgar is related in a complementary fashion to the manufactured and bartered off feeling, and indeed vulgarity is an aspect of every saleable feeling. It is as hard to say what is vulgar in artworks as to answer Erwin Ratz's question, how it is that art, whose a priori gesture protests against vulgarity, is yet capable of being integrated with the vulgar. Only in a mutilated fashion does the vulgar represent the plebeian that is held at a distance by the so-called high arts. When art has allowed itself, without condescension, to be inspired by a plebeian element, art has gained in an authentic weightiness that is the opposite of the vulgar. Art becomes vulgar through condescension, when, especially by means of humor, it appeals to deformed consciousness and confirms it. It suits domination of what it has made out of the masses, and what it drills into them can be chalked up to their own guilty desires. Art respects the masses by presenting itself to them as what they could be rather than by adapting itself to them in their degraded condition. Socially, the vulgar in art is the subjective identification with the object of the reproduced humiliation. In place of what is withheld from them, the masses reactively, resentfully, enjoy what is produced by renunciation and usurps the place of what has been renounced. It is ideology that low art, entertainment, is socially legitimate and self-evident. It is solely that condition that expresses the omnipresence of repression. Wow. This is some freaking sick burns that he's laying down right now. The model of aesthetic vulgarity is the child in the advertisement, taking a bite of chocolate with eyes half closed as if it were a sin. The repressed returns in the vulgar, bearing the marks of repression. It is the subjective expression of the failure of that sublimation that art praises so overzealously as catharsis, and for which it gives itself credit because it senses how little sublimation, like all culture, has actually turned out to date. In the age of total administration, culture no longer needs to humiliate the barbarians it has created. It suffices that by its rituals it strengthens the barbarism that has subjectively been sedimenting over centuries. That art stands as a reminder of what does not exist prompts rage. This rage is transferred to the image of that otherness and befouls it. The archetype of the vulgar that the art of the emancipatory bourgeoisie held in check, sometimes ingeniously, in its clowns, servants, and papagenos, are the grinning advertisement beauties whose praise of toothpaste brands unites the billboards of all lands. Those who know they are being cheated by so much feminine splendor blacken out the all too brilliant teeth of these archetypes, and in total innocence make the truth visible above the gleam of culture. This, at least, is perceived by the vulgar, because aesthetic vulgarity undialectically imitates the invariance of social degradation. It has no history. Its eternal return is celebrated by graffiti. No subject matter is ever to be taboo and excluded from art as vulgar. Vulgarity is a relation to the material and to those to whom the appeal is made. The expansion of the vulgar to the totality has meanwhile swallowed up what once laid claim to the noble and sublime. This is one of the reasons for the liquidation of the tragic. It succumbs in the denouement of the second act of Budapest operettas. Today, everything that goes under the name of light art is to be rejected. That also applies, however, to what is noble, the abstract antithesis to reification, and at the same time its booty. Ever since Baudelaire, the noble has been associated with political reaction, as if democracy, as such, a quantitative category of masses, and not the perpetuation of oppression, were the sources of the vulgar. Fidelity to the noble in art should be maintained, just as the noble should reflect its own culpability, its complicity with privilege. Its refuge remains exclusively the unflinching power of resistance in the act of forming. The noble becomes spurious and itself vulgar when it extols itself. For to this day there has not been anything noble. Contradiction gnaws at the noble ever since Hölderlin's verse that nothing sacred is any longer fit for use. The same contradiction that an adolescent might have sensed who read a socialist journal with political sympathy and at the same time was put off by the language and mentality and the ideological undercurrent of a culture for all. What that paper in fact promoted, of course, was not the potential of a freed people, but rather people as the complement of class society, the statically conceived universal of voters who must be reckoned with. The counter-concept to aesthetic comportment is, quite simply, the concept of the Philistine, which often overlaps with the vulgar, yet remains distinct from it by its indifference or hatred, whereas vulgarity greedily smacks its lips. Socially implicated in the guilt of those who lay claim to aesthetic nobility, the Philistine's disdain grants intellectual labor an immediately higher rank than manual labor. That art benefits from certain advantages becomes, for art's self-consciousness and for those who react aesthetically, something better in itself. This ideological element in art stands in need of permanent self-correction. Art is capable of this because, as the negation of practical life, it is itself praxis, and indeed not simply on the basis of its genesis and the fact that, like every artifact, it is the result of activity. Just as its content is dynamic in itself and does not remain self-identical, in the course of their history, the objectivated artworks themselves once again become practical comportments and turn toward reality. In this, art and theory are allied. Art recapitulates praxis in itself, modified and in a sense neutralized, and by doing so it takes up positions toward reality. Beethoven's symphonic language, which in its most secret chemistry is the bourgeois character process of production, as well as the expression of capitalism's perennial disaster, at the same time becomes a fait social by its gesture of tragic affirmation. Things are as they must and should be, and are therefore good. At the same time, this music belongs to the revolutionary process of bourgeois emancipation, just as it anticipates its apologetics. The more deeply artworks are deciphered, the less their antithesis to praxis remains absolute. They themselves are something other than their origin, their fundament, that is, this very antithesis to praxis, and they unfold the mediation of this antithesis. They are less than praxis and more. Less because, as was codified once and for all in Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata, they recoil before what must be done, perhaps even thwart it, although they are less capable of this than is suggested by Tolstoy's renegade asceticism. The truth content cannot be separated from the concept of humanity. Through every mediation, through all negativity, they are images of a transformed humanity and are unable to come to rest in themselves by any abstraction from this transformation. Art, however, is more than praxis because by its aversion to praxis, it simultaneously denounces the narrow untruth of the practical world. Immediate praxis wants to know nothing of this as long as the practical organization of the world has yet to succeed. The critique exercised a priori by art is that of action as a cryptogram of domination. According to its sheer form, praxis tends toward that which, in terms of its own logic, it should abolish. Violence is imminent to it and is maintained in its sublimations, whereas artworks, even the most aggressive, stand for nonviolence. They are a constant indictment of the workaday bustle and the practical individual, back of which is concealed the barbaric appetite of this species, which is not human as long as it permits itself to be ruled by this appetite and is fused with domination. The dialectical relation of art to praxis is that of its social effect. That artworks intervene politically is doubtful. When it does happen, most often it is peripheral to the work. If they strive for it, they usually succumb to their own terms. Their true social effect is an extremely indirect participation in spirit that, by way of subterranean processes, contributes to social transformation and is concentrated in artworks. They only achieve such participation through their objectivation. The effect of artworks is not that they present a latent praxis that corresponds to a manifest one, for their autonomy has moved far beyond such immediacy. Rather, their effect is that of recollection, which they evoke by their existence. If the historical genesis of artworks refers back to causal contexts, these do not disappear tracelessly in them. The process enacted internally by each and every artwork works back on society as the model of a possible praxis in which something on the order of a collective subject is constituted. However little the external effect matters in art, and however important its form is, its intrinsic form nevertheless has an effect. Therefore, the critical analysis of the effect of artworks has a great deal to say about what artworks, in their character as things, have sealed up in themselves. This could be demonstrated in the ideological effect of Wagner's music. It is not social reflection on artworks and their inner chemistry that is false, but rather the subordination of artworks to abstract social correlations determined from above that are indifferent to the tension between the historical causal nexus and the content of the work. Just how far artworks intervene on a practical level is incidentally determined not only by them, but far more importantly by the social moment. Beaumarchais's comedies were certainly not politically committed in the style of Brecht or Sartre, yet they in fact had a certain political effect because their tangible content harmonized with a social movement that relished finding itself flattered in them. Because it is second-hand, the social effect of art is obviously paradoxical. What is attributed to its spontaneity in fact depends on the general social tendency. Conversely, Brecht's work, which, beginning with Saint Joan of the Stockyards, wanted to provoke social change, was probably socially powerless, and the astute Brecht by no means deceived himself on this score. Its effect is captured by the English expression of preaching to the saved. His theater of alienation intended to motivate the viewer to think. Brecht's postulate of a thinking comportment converges, strangely enough, with the objective discernment that autonomous artworks presuppose in the viewer, listener, or reader as being adequate to them. His didactic style, however, is intolerant of the ambiguity in which thought originates. It is authoritarian. This may have been Brecht's response to the ineffectuality of his didactic plays. As a virtuoso of manipulative technique, he wanted to coerce the desired effect just as he once planned to organize his rise to fame. Nevertheless, it is not least of all due to Brecht that the artwork gained self-consciousness of itself as an element of political praxis and thus acquired a force opposed to its ideological blindness. Brecht's cult of practicality became an aesthetic constituent of his works, and it is not to be eliminated from what in his work stands at a remove from the realm of causal context, namely their truth content. The acute reason today for the social inefficacy of artworks those that do not surrender to crude propaganda, is that in order to resist the all-powerful system of communication, they must rid themselves of any communicative means that would perhaps make them accessible to the public. Artworks exercise a practical effect, if they do so at all, not by haranguing, but by the scarcely apprehensible transformation of consciousness. In any case, agitative effects dissipate rapidly, presumably because even artworks of that type are perceived under the general category of irrationality. The principle, of which they cannot rid themselves, stalls the immediate practical impulse. Aesthetic cultivation leads away from the pre-aesthetic contamination of art and reality. The distance acquired, which is its result, not only reveals the objective character of the artwork, it also affects the subjective comportment, in that it severs primitive identifications and puts the recipient qua empirical psychological person out of action, which benefits his relation to the work. Subjectively, art requires self-exteriorization. This is what was meant by Brecht's critique of empathic aesthetics. This exteriorization is, however, practical insofar as it determines the person who experiences art and steps out of himself as a Greek word, just as art itself is objectively praxis as the cultivation of consciousness, but it only becomes this by renouncing persuasion. Whoever takes up an objective stance vis-à-vis the artwork will hardly allow himself to become enthused by it in the fashion prescribed by the idea of a direct appeal. This would be incompatible with the comprehending attitude appropriate to the cognitive character of artworks. By the affront to reigning needs, by the inherent tendency of art to cast different lights on the familiar, artworks correspond to the objective need for a transformation of consciousness that could become a transformation of reality. The moment they hope to achieve the effect under whose absence they suffer by adapting to existing needs, they deprive people of precisely that which, to take the jargon of needs seriously and turn it against itself, they could offer them. Aesthetic needs are fairly vague and unarticulated. The practices of the culture industry have not changed this as much as they would like the world to believe, and, indeed, as much as many would like to claim. That culture failed implies that there actually are no subjective cultural needs independent of supply and the mechanisms of distribution. The need for art is itself largely ideological. Life would be possible without art, too, not only objectively, but also with regard to the psychological economy of consumers who, in modified circumstances, are easily moved to changing their taste, in that their taste follows the line of least resistance. In a society that has disaccustomed men and women from thinking beyond themselves, whatever surpasses the mere reproduction of their life and those things that they have been drilled to believe they cannot get along without is superfluous. What is true in the most recent rebellion against art is that, in the face of the absurdly incessant scarcity, the expanding and self-reproducing barbarism, the ever-present threat of total catastrophe, phenomena that are not preoccupied with the maintenance of life take on a ridiculous aspect. Whereas artists can afford to be indifferent to a cultural mechanism that in any case swallows up everything and excludes nothing, not even what is relatively good, this mechanism nevertheless tinges everything that thrives within it with something of its objective indifference. What Marx was still able to presuppose, to some degree innocently, as cultural needs in the concept of a society's general level of achievement has its dialectic in the fact that in the meantime one does culture a greater honor by foregoing it and not taking part in its festivals than by agreeing to be force-fed. Aesthetic motifs are no less critical of cultural needs than are empirically real ones. Artworks want to break up the eternal exchange of need and satisfaction, instead of doing injustice to unfulfilled needs by supplying them with substitute satisfactions. Every aesthetic and sociological theory of need makes use of what bears the characteristically old fashioned name of lived aesthetic experience. Its insufficiency is evident in the constitution of lived artistic experiences themselves, if such exist. The supposition of lived artistic experiences is based on the assumption of an equivalence between the content of experience, put crudely, the emotional expression of works, and the subjective experience of the recipient. A listener is, in other words, to become excited when the music seems to do so, whereas to the extent that one understands anything, one should become emotionally all the more disinterested the pushier the work's gesticulations become. Science could hardly think of anything more alien to art than those experiments that presume to measure aesthetic effect and aesthetic experience by recording the heartbeat. The fount of any such equivalence remains murky. What purportedly is to be lived or relived in the work, according to popular assumption, the feelings of the author, is itself only a partial element in works and certainly not the decisive one. Works are not depositions of impulses. In any case, such depositions are always more disliked by listeners and least likely to be empathically re-experienced. They are, however, rather radically modified by the autonomous nexus of the artwork. The interplay of the constructive and the mimetically expressive elements in art is simply suppressed or distorted by the theory of lived experience. The equivalence it posits is not an equivalence at all. Rather, one particular aspect is abstracted. This aspect, again removed from the aesthetic nexus of the work and translated back into the empirical world, for a second time becomes an other of what in any case it is in the work. The shock aroused by important works is not employed to trigger personal, otherwise repressed emotions. Rather, this shock is the moment in which recipients forget themselves and disappear into the work. It is the moment of being shaken. The recipients lose their footing. The possibility of truth, embodied in the aesthetic image, becomes tangible. This immediacy, in the fullest sense, of relations to artworks is a function of mediation, of penetrating and encompassing experience. It takes shape in the fraction of an instant, and for this the whole of consciousness is required, not isolated stimuli and responses. The experience of art as that of its truth or untruth is more than subjective experience. It is the eruption of objectivity into subjective consciousness. The experience is mediated through subjectivity precisely at the point where the subjective reaction is most intense. In Beethoven, many situations are scènes à faire, perhaps even with the flaw of being staged. The entrance of the Reprise in the Ninth Symphony, which is the result of the symphonic process, celebrates its original introduction. It resonates like an overwhelming "thus it is." The shudder is a response, colored by fear of the overwhelming. By its affirmation, the music at the same time speaks the truth about untruth. Non-judging, artworks point, as with their finger, to the content without its thereby becoming discursive. The spontaneous reaction of the recipient is mimesis of the immediacy of this gesture. In it, however, artworks are not exhausted. The position that this musical passage, once integrated, achieves by its gesture is subject to critique. It poses the question whether the power of being thus and not otherwise, at the epiphany of which such moments in art are aimed, is the index of its truth. Full comprehending experience, which terminates in judgment on the non-judging works, demands a decision and, by extension, the concepts. The lived experience is exclusively an element of such comprehending experience and faulty because it is subject to persuasion. Works such as the Ninth Symphony exercise a mesmerizing effect. The force they achieve through their structure becomes the force of their effect. In the development of music after Beethoven, the suggestive force of works, initially borrowed from society, has been shunted back to society and become agitative and ideological. Shudder, radically opposed to the conventional idea of experience, provides no particular satisfaction for the eye. It bears no similarity to desire. Rather, it is a memento of the liquidation of the eye, which, shaken, perceives its own limitedness and finitude. This experience is contrary to the weakening of the eye that the culture industry manipulates. For the culture industry, the idea of the shudder is idle nonsense. This is probably the innermost motivation of the de-aestheticization of art. To catch even the slightest glimpse beyond the prison that it itself is, the eye requires not distraction but rather the utmost tension that preserves the shudder and involuntary comportment, incidentally, from becoming regression. In his Aesthetic of the Sublime, Kant faithfully presented the power of the subject as the precondition of the sublime. True, the annihilation of the eye in the face of art is to be taken no more literally than as art. Because, however, what are called aesthetic experiences are as such psychologically real, it would be impossible to understand them if they were simply part and parcel of the illusoriness of art. Experiences are not as if. The disappearance of the eye in the moment of the shudder is not real, but delirium, which has a similar aspect, is nevertheless incompatible with artistic experience. For a few moments, the eye becomes aware, in real terms, of the possibility of letting self-preservation fall away, though it does not actually succeed in realizing this possibility. It is not the aesthetic shudder that is semblance, but rather its attitude to objectivity. In its immediacy, the shudder feels the potential as if it were actual. The eye is seized by the unmetaphorical, semblance-shattering consciousness that it itself is not ultimate, but semblance. For the subject, this transforms art into what is in itself, the historical voice of repressed nature, ultimately critical of the principle of the eye, that internal agent of repression. The subjective experience directed against the eye is an element of the objective truth of art. Whoever experiences artworks by referring them to himself does not experience them. What passes for experience is a palmed-off cultural surrogate. Even of this surrogate, one's conceptions are simplifications. The products of the culture industry, more shallow and standardized than any of its fans can ever be, may simultaneously impede the identification that is their goal. The question as to what the culture industry inflicts on men and women is probably all too naive. Its effect is much more diffuse than the form of the question suggests. The empty time filled with emptiness does not even produce false consciousness, but is an exertion that leaves things just as they are. All right, that's enough for today. I'll see you next time.